Okay, let's get right into it. We're tackling a massive topic for your GCSEs, conflict and tension in Asia. This is all about how the Cold War exploded onto a new continent, leading to two of the most significant wars of the 20th century. So here's our game plan. We're going to follow the AQA syllabus to a T. First, we'll set the scene, why Asia. Then we'll dive deep into the Korean War, followed by the long, complicated story of Vietnam, both how it started and how it ended. And finally, we'll wrap up with some crucial takeaways to help you nail those exam questions. All right, first things first, we have to understand the big picture. Why did Asia, of all places, suddenly become this major flashpoint after World War II? What turned the region into a brand new frontline for the superpowers? And here's the absolute key. You have to remember that the wars in Korea and Vietnam, well, they weren't just local squabbles. Not at all. They were what we call proxy wars. It was like a giant, deadly chess match between the USA and the Soviet Union, with China also being a huge player. The Americans were terrified of communism spreading, while the Soviets and Chinese were eager to help it grow. Every single battle was a move in that global game. Okay, so let's jump into our first case study. This is where that ideological battle really erupted into a full-blown, brutal war. People often call it the Forgotten War, but trust me, its consequences were absolutely massive and are still felt today. This slide gives you a perfect snapshot of the situation. After World War II, Korea was split right down the middle, along a line called the 38th parallel, and you can see the superpower influence written all over it. In the north, you've got the communist Kim Il-sung, propped up by the USSR and China. In the south, you've got the fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee, backed by the USA and, importantly, the United Nations. The stage was set for a massive collision. And what a collision it was. This timeline shows you the incredible seesaw nature of the war. First, the North Koreans storm south and almost win the whole thing in weeks. Then, bam, the UN, led by the Americans, pulls off a brilliant surprise landing at Incheon, completely turning the tables. But just as they reach the Chinese border, millions of Chinese soldiers pour into Korea, pushing the UN all the way back again. It's this insane back and forth that eventually grinds to a halt in a bloody, horrific stalemate. Now, this is a classic exam question, so listen up. With the immense power of the United States and the backing of the UN, how on earth could they not defeat North Korea and China? It seems like they had all the advantages, right? Well, it was way more complicated than that. The answer really comes down to these factors here. First, just the sheer number of Chinese troops was overwhelming. Then you have the whole drama with the American General MacArthur, who got fired because he wanted to take the war into China, maybe even use nuclear weapons. And that leads to the biggest reason of all, fear. Neither the USA nor the USSR wanted this to spiral into World War III, a nuclear war. So they settled for a draw, a stalemate, rather than risk destroying the world. Okay, on to our next major conflict, Vietnam. This is the one that really got messy for the United States. We're going to see how they got sucked into a long, brutal, and incredibly divisive war, a true quagmire that would haunt America for decades. If you want to understand why America got so deeply involved in Vietnam, you have to understand this one idea, the domino theory. Seriously, this is absolutely central. American leaders genuinely believed that if South Vietnam fell to communism, it would be the first domino in a chain. Laos would fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand, and so on. In their minds, they had to make a stand in Vietnam to stop the entire region from turning red. And you can see this wasn't a single decision to go to war. It was a gradual slide, an escalation. First, the French colonial rulers were kicked out. The U.S. stepped in, sending so-called advisors to help the South Vietnamese. Then, a murky incident in the Gulf of Tonkin gave President Johnson the green light he needed to send in hundreds of thousands of American combat troops. The war was on. But the U.S. military, which was built to fight a massive tank battle in Europe, had no idea what it was getting into. They weren't fighting an army they could see. They were fighting guerrillas, the Viet Cong, who could strike from anywhere and then just disappear. They used ambushes, booby traps, and these incredible complex tunnel systems. For the American soldiers, it was like fighting ghosts in the jungle. So America's strategy was just to use its overwhelming firepower, mass bombing campaigns, search and destroy missions, but it was a disaster. It led to horrific events like the My Lai massacre, which shocked the world. And then came the Tet Offensive in 1968. Now, militarily, the communists lost, but psychologically, it was a knockout blow to the U.S. It proved to everyone back home that, despite what the generals were saying, this war was nowhere near over. So, the war had become a catastrophe, both on the ground and back home. How did the United States finally get out? The next president, Richard Nixon, came into office promising peace with honor. The question was, could he deliver it? And here you see the crucial shift in strategy. Nixon realized that just throwing more American soldiers at the problem wasn't going to work. So he came up with a new plan, Vietnamization. The idea was to train and equip the South Vietnamese army so they could fight the war themselves. This would, in theory, allow American troops to withdraw without South Vietnam immediately collapsing. It was an exit strategy. Meanwhile, the pressure cooker back in America was about to explode. You had massive anti-war protests and horrific events like the Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed student protesters. And for the first time in history, television was bringing the brutal, uncensored reality of the war into people's living rooms every single night. The political will to continue the fight was just evaporating.
And this is how it all unraveled. Ironically, while Nixon was talking peace, he secretly expanded the bombing into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, causing a huge uproar. Eventually, a peace deal was signed in Paris in 1973, and the last American troops flew home. But that peace with honor didn't last. Without American support, the South Vietnamese army crumbled, and just 2 years later, in 1975, the world watched as North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. Communism had won.
Okay, deep breath. Let's pull all of that together into some key points that are going to be absolute gold for your exam answers. One of the top-level skills examiners are looking for is your ability to compare and contrast these two wars. Now, this table is your best friend for revision. It lays out the key differences side by side. Look at the causes. Korea was a clear conventional invasion across a border. Vietnam was a much messier civil war and insurgency. Look at the outcomes. Korea ended in a stalemate that's still frozen in place today, while Vietnam ended in a decisive communist victory. And crucially, look at public opinion. The war in Korea was generally supported back in the US. The war in Vietnam tore the country apart. Using these points will make your essays so much stronger. And I want to leave you with this one final thought, something to take your analysis a bit deeper. Beyond all the politics, the strategies, and the ideologies, what was the real cost of turning Asia into a superpower battlefield? We're talking about millions of lives, soldiers and civilians, lost, entire countries devastated, and a legacy of bitterness and trauma that in many ways still shapes our world today.